On the Rise of Fascism in Germany. Section 1. Paraphrase of the topic. Fascism took root in Germany beginning in the aftermath of World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and growing in prominence in the political scene throughout the 1920s and 30s. The man behind the movement was Adolf Hitler, who, with his intense charisma and persuasiveness, managed to turn the German populace to his side. He utilized many of the characteristics of fascism, such as glorifying a mythic past and vilifying any dissidents to their ideal future. Propaganda was also instrumental and vital in securing a voting bloc for Hitler, targeting those in the middle class, rural voters, and those who we would call the Aryans. I say that in air quotes. With them on his side, he could get away with many schemes and secure power. Thus, when one understands the concept and utilization of fascism, one can understand just how a megalomaniac such as Hitler was able to take power in Germany. The beginning of the hateful sentiment, vital in brewing the right conditions for a totalitarian dictatorship, happened with the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the First World War to a conclusion. Germany was on the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire as its allies. The other two powers in this alliance collapsed, leaving Germany intact but weakened greatly. Thus it was Germany who suffered the brunt of the treaty. Notable consequences inflicted on the country were a drastic decrease of the German military, cutting down to about 100,000 men, a demilitarization of the Rhineland, being forced to give up all of its overseas territories, and a reduction in the territory of the German state, leaving the major problem of the Polish corridor. Most notably, however, and the punishments that stoked the most hatred, were the massive reparations that Germany owed the Entente, the US, France, and Britain, that was virtually unpayable, and the war guilt clause, which placed sole blame on Germany. These conditions predictably fanned outrage and hatred towards the Entente, pushing many in a nationalist right-wing trend. In order to add further insult to injury, the weak Weimar Republic tried to ruin the German mark intentionally in the hopes to get off easily on the reparations. It backfired massively, and with the Great Depression affecting the world by the late 1920s and early 30s, many Germans were poor, jobless, and starving. They wondered who would solve their problems, and someone delivered. Adolf Hitler, an Austrian far-right nationalist, took charge of the German National Socialist Party, which one knows by its more common name, the Nazi Party. This party ran on a fascist platform, much like Benito Mussolini had done in Italy. The concept of fascism is a populist movement based not on a manipulation of popular belief, but based on enthusiasm. It cast aside intellectualism, turning its focus on a purity of the group. Fascist revolutions are about, in the fascist mind, tempering one's character and enhancing a group's culture and community. Robert O. Paxson outlined a series of steps for establishing a fascist movement in a country. First, one must hold their own race or ethnicity in high regard, told that their group is supreme above all others, in this case the Nordic Aryan Germans. Second, said group must be victimized and can use violence to justify others. A common example is the "they're out to get us" sentiment, referencing the Jews in this context. Third, the leader must paint decadence and individualism and liberalism as something the group must fear. Fourth, they must establish a tightly knit community. This is the principle of Volksgemeinschaft. Fifth, there needs to be an all-powerful leader, the Führer, as the Nazis referred to Hitler, who he alone could save the group. German kids who were in youth camps were taught and instilled this belief, even having little booklets romanticizing Hitler. Finally, they must romanticize violence as a struggle for the group. With a party and ideology established, the Nazis at first went through legal means to achieve power by performing in general elections. However, despite his party's growing popularity, Hitler found that his party did not get enough votes in the parliament. As a result, he and other members of his party snuck into the Reichstag, the parliamentary building, and burned it. He blamed it on communists and was able to secure emergency powers from the Chancellor von Hindenburg. The Nazi Party made promises to get rid of splintering factions from the era of Kaiser Wilhelm, and used the principle of Volksgemeinschaft to attempt to unite the Aryan Germans. They were able to capture more voters, particularly in the middle class, as they grew disillusioned with the traditional liberal and conservative parties. They weren't able to solve the German populace's problems, though. Center-left parties introduced workplace reforms, but the middle class saw it as focusing on only their base and not the German population as a whole. There was a new sentiment among the middle class that the center-left and center-right parties were being run for and by the elite, thus attracting still more voters to fringe parties like the Nazis. A power vacuum was being created, and Nazis were able to snatch up voters. In addition to the middle class, younger people were also a demographic for the Nazis. Many of them were among the hardest hit in the fallout of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, and, infuriated by Germany's loss, they and other ex-officers were persuaded by the Nazis and their myth of an ideal past, justifying any use of violence. The Nazis also carry out violence to crush dissidents and instill fear. One notable example is the Ku Klux Klan, who also used violence to make blacks and white Republicans at the time fearful of them in America. Along with Hitler's legal means of achieving power and his use of violence against the opposition, he cemented his position and could keep his population in line. Finally, in power, the Nazi government instituted anti-Semitic curriculums in schools to brainwash children. Children, in the eyes of the Nazis, were the future of the party and the country and were valued heavily. Books such as Der Giftpilz contained anti-Semitic messages and created the idea of a Jew being subhuman, while also preaching a Volksgemeinschaft. History was changed to make the Nazis appear in a good light, and in other classes, war motifs were common, which might have been used to groom young children for war. A geography textbook had lessons on Lebensraum, or living space, for the Aryan Germans. Nazis used propaganda that portrayed the mainstream parties as elitist and out of touch, while stressing that the Nazis advocated for the common person. They also struggled at first to convince those working in agriculture to join their party, but they changed their agriculture policies to attract groups like the Reichslandbund, which persuaded other agriculture workers. In short, the Nazis used a new kind of propaganda called senso-propaganda, which was flashier than the more pragmatist ratio propaganda. The former used hand gestures, images, sounds, and colors to attract an audience. Hitler was able to captivate his large audiences by many methods. By using logic and disguising it behind emotion, for example, audiences could not pick up on the logic, they only felt the faith and emotion behind it. Call and response methods were used in Hitler's speech, saying the despicable phrase Heil would trigger Heil Hitler. In response, the repetition would further convince the audience bit by bit for each call and response. In finality, the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party came together due to many incidents that just happened to stir up an anti-establishment, nationalist sentiment based on furthering the goals of the Aryans at the expense of Jews and the other groups. Section 2. Proving the hypothesis. In the 1920s, the political ideology of fascism arose, combining extreme nationalism with a shift to the fringes of the right wing. This movement originated from the effects of the Treaty of Versailles, which generated uncertainty, anger, and outrage in Germany. Most notably, the war guilt clause and the high reparations Germany owed was enough to create uncertainty and anger towards the victors of the First World War. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the growing Nazi Party, played on people's fears, anger, and anxiety to create an expansive base for his party. But how did this lead to Hitler creating such a large base? How was Hitler able to captivate a large audience that would side with his extreme fringe beliefs and dare not question anything he said? The Treaty of Versailles, of course, created a hateful sentiment towards the Entente due to its consequences, such as cutting down the army and territory. However, what affected the German population the most was the massive reparations they owed to the Entente and to the war guilt clause, which placed sole blame for the war on Germany. This created low morale among Germans and with the Great Depression made them impoverished and hungry. Many people in Germany during the Depression looked back at a better past. The nostalgia of a lost paradise is in the origin of the promises of redemption that gave sense and popularity to nationalism and populism before World War I and to totalitarianisms after 1918. This mood of loss dramatically increased the ordeal of the war and nurtured likewise their emphasis on the organic nature of power in society, their idea of liberalism as the original sin of modernity, and accordingly their faith in a race, a nation, or a social class as the chosen people sent by Providence to put an end to a fatal alteration of the course of history. One of the tenets of fascism is nostalgia for a mythic past. In this case, the nostalgia for the past was the time before the Depression and the war guilt clause. These two events created resentment and hatred among the German population and shifted them politically to the far right. They sought to make Germany greater to emerge from these troubles like a phoenix. Take, for instance, the stab-in-the-back myth. This was a big lie that stated that the reason why Germany lost World War I was mainly because of Jews apparently sabotaging the war effort, not because of greater coherence with the Entente and their eventual victory, which led to anti-Semitic beliefs gaining prominence. Another development which created unrest and hatred was the occupation of the Ruhr, an industrial powerhouse of Germany, by the French in 1920 to force them to pay the reparations. This action by the French prompted resistance by the Germans. At the beginning of 1923, the French sent 60,000 troops into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to force reparation payments from an unwilling Germany. There was an immediate reaction from the common people of Germany, who participated in demonstrations, strikes, and work slowdowns. Under pressure from below, the government organized a campaign of passive resistance to the French occupation. It was a confusing time. It was hard to tell if workers were striking out of nationalist passion or class hatred for their employers like Krupp and Thyssen, who continued to amass greater and greater profits. It was quite plain that the Ruhr was a part of Germany, so naturally it would have sparked outrage by Germans, those living in the Ruhr and those living elsewhere. The French forcibly occupied the area, making the Germans resentful. It was somewhat like if a tax collector armed with a baton shows up at one's residence menacingly. In response, it created an anti-foreign sentiment as well as an anti-corporate feeling. The population felt like they had been left behind due to their employers still making large profits during the occupation. Corporations were notorious during this time for its amassment of profit while Germans had very little money. While it led to social and economic resentment, it also created political resentment. The economic dislocations made all groups more jealous of their socio-economic interests and more strident and narrow in their political demands, while making the middle classes increasingly resentful of both workers and big business, who were seen as having a disproportionate influence over the national government and political parties. By fighting for measures such as the 8-hour day and better wages, the SPD, the Socialist Party, was considered to be serving the class interests of its core constituency above all else. The contrast between real, if limited, SPD success and the political impotence of the middle classes generated further paroxysms of anti-socialist fervor. It must be made quite clear that the Germans saw corporations as having large control and influence over the mainstream political parties. They also saw the mainstream parties as serving their own base rather than the German population as a whole. This led to mass disillusionment among the Germans with their parties. Many left them, which formed a sort of power vacuum. Which party was now going to pick those voters up? The NSDAP, more commonly referred to as the Nazi Party, was based on several fascist ideas and philosophies. It was a populist party which was immediately appealing to the population because it was a political party for the people against the elite, which the masses saw as self-serving and not doing anything helpful for Germany. Their ideas were attracted to the Germans outlined in the list. 1. The primacy of the group, toward which one has duties superior to every right, whether universal or individual. 2. The belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment which justifies any action against the group's enemies, internal as well as external. 3. Dread of the group's decadence under the corrosive effect of individualistic and cosmopolitan liberalism. 4. Closer integration of the community within a brotherhood, fascio, whose unity and purity are forged by common conviction, if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. 5. An enhanced sense of identity and belonging, in which the grandeur of the group reinforces individual self-esteem. 6. Authority of national leaders, always male, throughout society, culminating in a national chieftain who alone is capable of incarnating the group's destiny. 7. The beauty and violence of will, when they are devoted to the group's success in a Darwinian struggle. The first step of a fascist movement is that a certain group, the in-group, feels that they are superior to every other group. This was the middle and the working class Germans. Second, the in-group must be victimized, which justifies action against the out-group, everyone else. The in-group felt like everyone was out to get him, to use the common vernacular. The countries of the Entente were invading and occupying areas of Germany and were forcing unpayable reparation. Corporations were taking advantage of them, Jews were betraying their country, etc. Third, the in-group must fear individualism and liberalism. Generally, when a country is experiencing something devastating to their constituents, collectivist policies that are for the greater good are used, such as lockdowns during the COVID-19 pandemic for a modern example. To get out of these hard conditions, the Germans were supposed to fear individualism, which corporations used, which was viewed as selfishness. Fourth, the in-group must unite around common values. The most disadvantaged Germans, the in-group, found themselves taking on anti-imperialist, anti-corporatist, and far-right values. The final two steps are a masculine, powerful leader who he alone can save the in-group, and the romanticization of violence to further the in-group's goals. These were represented by the emergence of Adolf Hitler and the still growing far-right sentiments in Germany. The Nazi Party started out on a rough footing in the 1920s. However, it wouldn't be long before the party would swell with new members. Recall that the power vacuum that was formed from the disillusionment with the traditional political parties. These constituents of those parties were looking for a solution to their problems caused by the Depression and the Treaty of Versailles. This particular time in the political scene was ideal for growing the Nazi Party. During the 1920s, the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, was stagnant, low on funds and unable to fill meeting halls or amass a significant share of the vote. By 1926, the situation had become so dire that the party began to move towards a major shift in strategy. Where previously the NSDAP had focused primarily on urban areas and working-class voters, it now reoriented its appeal toward the middle classes, non-voters, and farmers, while proclaiming itself to be above the group divisions that plagued the country. What enabled the Nazis to make such spectacular inroads into the German electorate? A significant part of the answer, however, lies with contemporary German civil society. As voters abandoned traditional bourgeois parties during the 1920s and then grappled with the ravages of the Depression, a political vacuum opened up in German politics, a vacuum that offered the Nazis a golden opportunity to assemble an unprecedented coalition. One key thing to note here is that the Nazi Party changed its focus on a coalition. They previously had focused on, as explained, in the urban areas and working-class voters. But remember, it was the middle class who had felt the most serious effects, who felt that they were left behind. They instead turned to the fringe, such as the Nazi Party, who had made promises about doing things for the greater good and against libertarianism, and promises of advancing the in-group's goals. Another key group to mention was the agricultural workers. They were initially ignored by the Nazi Party and weren't very fond of the party due to their land programs. These included state seizure of land and reform of the land. However, soon the party realized that the farmers, who were also hit by the Depression and the effects of the Treaty of Versailles, would make up a large voting bloc. Thus, the Nazis changed their programs to fit in new crowds. After all, without the necessary voting bases, how can a party be successful in elections? In his quest to find new crowds, Hitler would often give very bombastic, energy-filled speeches filled with clever speaking devices to convince audiences to his side. Speaking was one of Hitler's gifts, but used it in a very horrifying, evil way. His speeches, for instance, were logically constructed, but the inner logic was disguised by the rhythm and activity of the voice. The audience thus experienced the logic in the speeches emotionally. They felt only the militancy and the faith without grasping the real content or reflecting on its meaning. What can be said about his base was that many, especially once they gained voters who were uneducated or poor, they would not be able to understand what was actually being said. All they'd be able to see was the passion, the emotion, and their faith to Hitler. There were different kinds of propaganda that future scholars would research. Propaganda is employed in different ways, like so. The old liberal ratio propaganda would be replaced, therefore, by the new irresistible senso-propaganda. Images, gestures, sounds, colors, much better adapted, according to Sergei Katokin, to the age of the masses. The old government's use of propaganda, ratio propaganda, logos, was dry and unappealing compared to Hitler's implementation of senso-propaganda. This form was flashier, bombastic, and attractive to the eyes and the senses, which attracted more people and convinced many still. It implemented symbols, gestures, images, emotions, colors, rituals, sounds, and cries. And one very important device to convince audiences was repetition. If one repeats a phrase or a fact, the more ingrained it becomes in one's mind. For example, the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini used the phrase duce, duce, duce as a call and response. Likewise, whenever Hitler would say the phrase Sieg Heil, the audience would reply with a Heil Hitler. The audiences would then repeat this phrase lots of times. This tactic was also employed in, most recently, the MAGA movement in late 2010s. When the former President Donald Trump would campaign, he would say a phrase and elicit a response from the audience. For example, Hillary, in reference to his political opponent Hillary Clinton, would trigger a lock her up, and Mexico would trigger a build the wall. More recently, in the 2020 election, whenever Trump would say anything about the election, his base would chant stop the steal and repeat it lots of times over and over. Case in point, repetition and call and response tactics were implemental in securing a base for far-right leaders. Propaganda devices in speaking are especially effective in drawing an audience and furthers the faith the in-group has with the leader. In 1932, the Nazis did not do very well in general elections, despite an ever-growing voting bloc. In revenge for this, several Nazis snuck into the parliamentary building, the Reichstag, and burnt it. Hitler soon was able to blame this attack on communists, persuading the chancellor at the time to give him emergency powers. His power in the government began to grow steadily, and soon he had introduced measures to indoctrinate children into his party. A feature peculiar to 20th century dictatorships was their concern with reaching the juvenile mind. Youth was to be courted by the state, trained, educated, and organized. In Mein Kampf, Hitler confidently predicted that the children and youth of Germany could be won for all time to the movement. This process was to take mainly through propaganda and involvement in the Hitler Youth organizations. The overriding tenet of the Nazi educational philosophy was a political indoctrination of the youth. After all, it was this generation that would instill the Nazi Weltanschauung ideology and create the Neuordnung, New Order in Europe. There are two ways one can interpret this in regards to how the Nazis valued children. By a philosophical standpoint, the whole point of indoctrinating them was to raise them to be the future of Nazi Germany. They would be the ones to carry out the goals and agendas of the Nazis. Next, there is a psychological standpoint. Children's brains, particularly younger ones, are not yet developed for critical thinking. That is, they cannot think for themselves easily. What they learn are the things they are taught by adults. For example, if a teenager was confronted with an anti-Semitic lesson, he or she would be able to tell that this passage is wrong and unethical. But how would a child, by comparison, be able to tell that a passage like that is wrong? They're taught that lesson by an adult. Therefore, children were among the easiest targets to persuade. The educational curriculum of children under the Nazi regime was often a reflection of the Nazi agenda. For example, that like the previous one, anti-Semitism was a key concept of Nazi education. Anti-Semitism was the overwhelming topic in every school curriculum. Indeed, the propaganda picture books published by Der Stürmer, the organ responsible for the dissemination of many of the anti-Semitic publications during the Hitler years, demonstrate that anti-Semitism was taught before the children were 6 or 7 or 8. Again, to demonstrate the fact that children would be among the easiest to persuade, children were taught anti-Semitic curriculums from a very young age. For example, in schools at the time, race science was a course that kids had to take. This course instructed the kids that the German Aryans were superior and that Jews were inferior. Anti-Semitic beliefs also took the form of colorful but discriminatory children's stories, such as their gift pills, which reflected the belief that Nazis were good and Jews were essentially poison to society. If one is taught anti-Semitism, those thoughts and ideals will become integral to one's morals and character. Anti-Semitism was not the only belief propagated in children's education. As put by Avershi Gutam in his work Pedagogical Nazi Propaganda, the impression of Hitler Youth was such that any boy or girl who was a member of the organization felt proud. They were groomed both mentally and physically to be fit to join the military later on, and were indoctrinated since childhood through the elaborate and deeply entrenched propaganda machinery of Nazis, which ranged from classrooms to libraries to the playground to their homes. The curriculum included lessons centered around the war motif, which, as Gutam puts it, they were groomed to be fit to join the military later on. One example of one of these courses with a war motif was that of a mathematics class. One problem in particular asked how much fuel a bomber would need to attack enemy cities. A geography textbook explained the idea of Lebensraum, which was the idea of more living space for ethnic Germans to take at the expense of minority groups. The same textbook also had a chapter on how Germany's geographical position was surrounded. It stated that Germany was situated in the middle, i.e. the heart of Europe. The World War showed how grave a danger Germany's central position was. Germany was surrounded by enemies. All access to the sea and to neutral countries was blocked, which allowed for a successful food blockade. The National Socialist government drew the necessary conclusions from Germany's unfavorable central location and took the steps necessary to ensure that Germany would never again find itself in a situation similar to that at the end of the World War. This part of the text had the heading, Building the New Germany, Gutam. Through this section of the textbook, it pushed the idea of they're out to get us to the children by quite literally explaining that their country was surrounded by other countries and did not have many geographical advantages, but the only way to get out of the situation was by Lebensraum, which means living space, thus pushing the agenda of the Nazi Party onto children. Hitler and the Nazi Party were able to convince children of their programs and mold them into unquestioning members of the party by way of indoctrination and of their goals at a very young age. The children's brains were not yet fully developed, so they trusted the adults in the room, who were peddling the discriminatory and pro-Nazi curriculums set by Hitler. Furthermore, the Nazi Party struggled at first with forming a base and secured voting bloc, but in part due to Hitler's charisma and excellent speaking skills, he was able to charm an audience and gain recognition. He also used lies and falsehoods to make his followers believe him. He lied that the Jews were out to destroy Germany, he lied that he would make Germany great, but his lies were effective. These tactics of persuasion were used so much during the rise of Hitler and his reign, from gaining political power for his party to creating future members of the Nazi Party. By persuading large amounts of people in Germany, he would create a populace that would turn a blind eye to, or even support, the atrocities committed by Hitler and his party, most notably the Holocaust. But while totalitarian regimes such as the Nazis happened over 80 years again, we must be aware and on the lookout for when a far-right leader decides to come to power. The Western world has and has been experiencing an ideological shift to the right among the population and the government. Germany, for instance, is seeing a resurgence of far-right movements. France, in its last presidential election, saw Marine Le Pen, a far-right political leader of an anti-immigration party, challenging Emmanuel Macron. And most notably for us Americans, 2016 saw the election of Donald Trump, a far-right contender for the presidency. His 2016 campaign eerily echoed tactics that past fascists have used, such as violence at rallies, the aforementioned call and response tactics, and large sensationalist rallies and speeches. Throughout his presidency, far-right groups such as the Proud Boys, Three Percenters, Ku Klux Klan, and QAnon have been emboldened under Trump's leadership. He used and spread a lie of election fraud to rile up his followers, culminating in the Capitol insurrection on January 6, the final act of a presidency closely similar to that of far-right totalitarian dictatorships. A police officer died, as his 4 rioters, and 2 police who would later commit suicide. How would this have happened? Why? It happened because a far-right leader was able to convince his followers to believe in a lie that he created, to make them believe in anything he says. You may have heard the phrase, "it can't happen here," in reference to fascism and the far right. That phrase is hopelessly naive. It has happened here. It will continue to happen here. It will happen unless people combat it with education and knowledge.